Atlantic Ocean, winter, 1943. The night is black, moonless, and silent except for the low thunder of engines beneath the waves. A convoy of Liberty ships cut slowly through the icy Atlantic, their hulls glistening with salt and frost. On deck, sailors huddle against the wind, eyes scanning the horizon for the faint ripple of a periscope. The smell of oil and cold iron hangs in the air, but these ships carry no soldiers. Inside their cavernous holds lie something else entirely: the bones of a factory. Crates of machine tools, entire assembly lines labeled and numbered, turbines packed in grease and steel, each part waiting to be reassembled on another continent. Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh, disassembled and sent to war. Thousands of miles away, under blackout skies in England and North Africa, foundations wait. Empty hangars, barren warehouses, soon to roar with the same machines that once powered America's heartland. The Germans knew America could build weapons. What they never imagined was that it could ship the very means of building them. In 1939, America stood apart from Europe's chaos. The Great Depression had hollowed its industries. Its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. Isolationist sentiment still dominated Congress and the press. Factories built cars, radios, and refrigerators, not tanks or bombers. Yet quietly, an industrial beast was sleeping. When war erupted in September 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood something others did not. Modern wars were no longer won by manpower or courage alone. They were won by production, by the ability to outbuild, outfuel, and outship the enemy. In December 1940, he stood before the nation and declared, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." It was more than a slogan. It was a strategic prophecy. Within months, industrial America began to shift its gears. Auto plants stopped producing sedans and began stamping out machine gun mounts and aircraft engines. General Motors designed tanks. Ford built bombers. In California, new shipyards rose from empty coastlines. Vast fields of cranes, sparks, and steel plates. By mid-1941, over half of America's factory capacity was tied to defense production. The transformation was unlike anything in history. Assembly lines once measured in hundreds of feet were now measured in miles. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan became the largest factory under one roof in the world, producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Boeing's production in Seattle doubled, then tripled. What had taken the British months to manufacture, America could now do in days. The German high command knew America was large. What it didn't grasp was how mobile its industry had become. To German planners, a factory was a fixed target. Bomb it, occupy it, destroy it. But American factories were built differently. Modular, reconfigurable, designed to be disassembled and replicated anywhere there was concrete and power. Even before the United States formally entered the war, blueprints for mobility were taking shape. Under the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, Roosevelt ordered the shipment not just of weapons, but of the means to make them abroad: tool sets, presses, entire production lines. A single convoy could carry the industrial heart of a small nation. Britain received rolling mills and aircraft jigs. The Soviet Union, tractor plants and refineries. The world had never seen industry behave like this, as a living organism, moving and expanding across continents. Then came December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Overnight, the arsenal of democracy became a war machine. Within weeks, U.S. industrial output was redirected completely to war production. Civilian car manufacturing ceased entirely. America built 50,000 aircraft in 1942, 96,000 in 1943, and more ships than every other nation combined. But it wasn't simply quantity, it was adaptability. The same logistics system that could deliver a car to Kansas could now deliver a refinery to North Africa. Factories learned to move, on paper, in crates, across oceans. The U.S. Maritime Commission and Warshipping Administration coordinated fleets of Liberty and Victory ships, each capable of carrying thousands of tons of prefabricated industrial material. Engineers designed plants in modular segments, marked with color codes and assembly numbers, so they could be reconstructed quickly on foreign soil. This wasn't a miracle. It was the culmination of decades of American industrial culture, standardization, mass production, interchangeable parts. But in wartime, it became a weapon. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence watched but misunderstood. Reports of U.S. factory construction were dismissed as propaganda. In Berlin, industrial experts estimated that America would take years to mobilize. They assumed the Atlantic would act as a natural barrier, that even if America built weapons, it couldn't transport the immense machinery needed to sustain production abroad. They were wrong. By 1942, the first American-built plants were rising in Britain: aircraft assembly lines, vehicle repair depots, ammunition works. In the Soviet Union, U.S. engineers supervised the installation of machine tools unloaded at Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. Even oil refineries were shipped in pieces, bolted together under freezing skies. To the Germans, the Atlantic was a moat. To the Americans, it became a highway of industry. And as the convoys multiplied, a new kind of warfare was emerging. One fought not on the front lines but on the docks and assembly floors, where crates of steel and crates of dreams were turned into the engines of Allied survival. By 1942, America was no longer merely producing weapons. It was producing the capacity to produce them, anywhere on Earth. What began in Detroit's auto plants was now unfolding across the world's oceans. The Atlantic was the artery of this new kind of war. In convoys stretching for miles, gray ships carried not just crates of ammunition, but the steel skeletons of industry itself. Cranes loaded locomotive engines, diesel generators, power turbines, and prefabricated factory panels, all destined for Britain, North Africa, and the Soviet Arctic. Each Liberty ship was a floating warehouse of progress, cheap, fast to build, and expendable if necessary. They were welded, not riveted, an American innovation that allowed entire ships to be completed in just a few weeks. Over 700 were launched by war's end, but their true power was not in their number. It was in what they carried. One might deliver a mobile aircraft repair unit, complete with tool benches and electrical wiring. Another could hold the components of a complete oil refinery, ready to be reassembled in Persia to keep the Red Army's tanks running. Others carried steel mills, aluminum smelters, even breweries, everything that kept an army and a society alive. Britain, battered and blockaded, became the first great recipient of America's movable industry. Between 1941 and 1944, entire manufacturing lines were transplanted across the Atlantic. The British aircraft industry received new presses and jigs to replace those destroyed by the Blitz. Vehicle depots sprang up across the countryside, assembled from prefabricated American materials. British engineers marveled at the precision. Every bolt, every beam, numbered, catalogued, and accompanied by diagrams so clear that a team of fitters could rebuild the structure without ever having seen it before. This modularity was the quiet genius behind the miracle. American engineers had reduced the factory to a kit. What had once been a static monument of brick and machinery was now a transportable organism, standardized and scalable. The Soviets received even greater gifts through the perilous Arctic convoys. From 1941 to 1945, the United States sent over 17 million tons of cargo to the USSR, not only tanks and trucks, but entire industrial complexes, machine tools from Buffalo, steel rolling mills from Chicago. Even complete tire factories were shipped piece by piece through icy waters haunted by U-boats. At Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, Soviet workers unloaded these crates under constant danger, assembling them in the Urals and Siberia. There, far from the front lines, America's exported factories helped forge the steel and fuel that would roll back the Wehrmacht. To the Germans, such feats seemed impossible. They had assumed industrial war to be a continental game, Europe's resources pitted against Europe's factories. They never considered that an entire continent across the sea could not only outproduce them, but export production itself. Meanwhile, in the South Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the same logistical magic unfolded. American engineers constructed prefabricated bases, Quonset huts, radar stations, workshops, across Ascension Island, Liberia, and Ceylon. In North Africa, where Rommel's Africa Corps once advanced across empty desert. American mobile plants followed the retreat, setting up repair shops and fuel depots almost as quickly as front lines moved. It was as if the very soil of the earth had begun to sprout factories overnight. Behind this enormous effort was an invisible network in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Maritime Commission, and thousands of shipping planners who synchronized oceanic logistics with industrial schedules back home. The success of any battle, in Tunisia, Sicily, or Normandy, depended on this hidden machinery of transport and reassembly. By 1943, the scale of this industrial migration defied belief. American shipyards on both coasts produced so many vessels that even when losses to U-boats peaked, replacement ships exceeded them within weeks. Each convoy became a self-contained ecosystem of repair and replenishment. A Liberty ship could carry spare propellers for other ships, portable cranes to unload itself, and the components of new shipyards to be built overseas. It was total war translated into total logistics. And yet, to the German High Command, the illusion persisted. Reports of American-built installations in Africa and Britain were treated as exaggerations. The Kriegsmarine still believed that if they could sever the Atlantic link, the Allies would collapse. But they were fighting a ghost, an industrial system so vast, so fluid, that even when a convoy sank, its replacements were already halfway across the ocean. By the end of 1943, the United States had achieved what no power in history had done before. It had turned the oceans into extensions of its assembly lines. Factories no longer belonged to geography. They belonged to logistics. And that logistical supremacy, the ability to ship not just weapons, but the means to create them, would soon reshape the very nature of the war itself. The next stage would show what happened when these transplanted industries began to operate in unison, when the arsenal of democracy reached full rhythm and turned production into a weapon more decisive than any bomb or bullet. Before a single crate left New York Harbor, millions of ordinary Americans were already fighting the war in ways that required no rifles. In the vast glowing halls of factories from Detroit to Long Beach, the war's invisible army took shape. Welders, riveters, machinists, truck drivers, and shipbuilders. By 1943, 1 out of every 3 workers in the American war industry was a woman. They learned to operate lathes, pour molten steel, and assemble aircraft engines with a precision that would have stunned the engineers of the pre-war years. Rosie the Riveter became more than a poster. She was the human emblem of a logistical revolution. Every crate shipped across the ocean carried the fingerprints of those workers. Each marked panel or labeled turbine was a fragment of their labor, carefully catalogued so it could be rebuilt thousands of miles away. They might never have seen the deserts of North Africa or the bombed fields of England, but their work arrived there just the same, humming in the engines of Allied bombers and grinding in the gears of tanks that bore no resemblance to the cars they once built. They weren't soldiers, yet they were frontline participants in the most immense logistical operation in human history. Their war was fought in 12-hour shifts, under the glow of arc lights and the endless roar of production. Factories became battlegrounds of output. Failure meant starvation at the front. Success meant survival of nations. And through that human tide of labor, America transformed not only its economy but its identity from a peacetime republic into a war machine built by citizens who understood that every rivet was a bullet in the global fight for freedom. The Germans built exquisite machines, but they built them for fixed places. The Americans built systems designed to move. At the heart of the American logistical miracle was a philosophy of standardization. Every nut, bolt, and panel adhered to national specifications. Machines were interchangeable, factories modular, tools uniform. That meant a gearbox produced in Ohio could fit a vehicle assembled in Birmingham or Bizerte without modification. This obsession with compatibility created the blueprint for mobile industry. Factories were divided into sections: structural, mechanical, electrical, each capable of being packed separately and reassembled in the field. Engineers at the War Production Board and companies like Bechtel and Kellogg devised prefabrication methods for everything from airstrips to oil refineries. One remarkable innovation was the factory-in-a-box concept. Entire machine shops designed to fit into standardized shipping containers, an early ancestor of the modern cargo system. These portable workshops could land on a beach, connect to a generator, and begin producing parts within days. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers mastered the logistics of these transfers. They developed color-coded assembly manuals so any team of technicians could rebuild complex structures quickly. Quonset huts, steel arch buildings invented in Rhode Island in 1941, became the universal shell of these operations. More than 150,000 were built, easy to ship, faster to erect, and strong enough to survive tropical storms or Arctic snow. Everywhere the Allies went, they left behind these metal crescents, a distinct American signature of mobility and foresight. The Germans, bound to traditional industrial geography, couldn't match this adaptability. Their plants were rooted in the Ruhr, Silesia, and Austria, vulnerable to bombing, irreplaceable when lost. The Americans had made their factories amphibious. By the mid-war years, technology itself had become a weapon of movement. Portable power plants, modular docks, collapsible cranes. Each innovation allowed the U.S. to project industrial power across any ocean or continent. In war, mobility was supremacy, and America had turned engineering into a strategy of motion. At the center of this vast transformation stood Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man who understood that modern warfare was not about front lines, but supply lines. When Roosevelt delivered his Arsenal of Democracy address in December 1940, he wasn't simply rallying the public. He was issuing a directive to industry. He summoned executives from Ford, General Motors, General Electric, Bethlehem Steel, and countless others to Washington, demanding they think not in terms of profit, but of capacity. He was blunt. We're going to need everything you can build, and faster than you think possible. Roosevelt's administration built bridges between government and industry on an unprecedented scale. The War Production Board, created in 1942, acted as the conductor of an industrial orchestra, assigning raw materials, standardizing designs, and eliminating duplication. Behind it, the Office of War Mobilization coordinated shipping, labor, and finance. But Roosevelt's genius lay in understanding morale as deeply as machinery. He framed production not merely as duty, but as defense of civilization. Each factory worker was a soldier with a wrench. Each shipyard was a battlefield of efficiency. He once remarked privately that machines are the new infantry, and he treated them as such. Under his leadership, vast public-private alliances formed: Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards, Ford's bomber plants, Standard Oil's refineries, all synchronized by central planning, but powered by private innovation. It was capitalism weaponized for democracy. Even before American troops landed in Europe, Roosevelt's system had already won the war of numbers. His ability to harness the full industrial spectrum, from farmers to financiers, made possible what no dictatorship could achieve: not merely mass production, but mass mobilization of production itself. That vision turned American factories into tools of strategy. And when those tools were shipped across the seas, they carried with them the living idea that a free nation, once unified, could outbuild tyranny. As Roosevelt's factories thundered and the convoys multiplied, the human, technological, and leadership forces converged into one unstoppable rhythm, the heartbeat of industrial victory. Soon, even the enemy would begin to sense that something far greater than weapons was crossing the seas. In the war rooms of Berlin, the American industrial surge was seen through a haze of arrogance and disbelief. German intelligence reports on U.S. output were frequently dismissed as Anglo propaganda. The Reich's planners, steeped in a tradition of European warfare, could not conceive of factories that moved, nor of an enemy who could replace an entire production line faster than they could destroy it. Adolf Hitler himself was skeptical. He had been assured by his economic advisors that the United States, with its consumer economy and scattered industries, would be slow to convert to war footing. In 1941, he told Albert Speer, "The Americans build for comfort, out for conflict." That illusion persisted deep into the war. The Luftwaffe's analysts, evaluating American aircraft production, believed the numbers were exaggerated. They assumed that even if America could produce thousands of bombers, it lacked the logistical capacity to maintain or deploy them across oceans. But the reality was harsher. When German reconnaissance flights photographed new airfields and depots in England in 1943, they didn't realize that many of those installations had been assembled from ships, prefabricated American metal, reconstituted on British soil. They believed they were seeing temporary staging posts, not transplanted factories. By the time the Reich's economists began to understand the scope of Lend-Lease, the millions of tons of materials, the equipment shipped not just to Britain but to the Soviet Union, to China, to Africa, it was too late. The math was irreversible. Speer, later reflecting on the war, admitted that Germany had fundamentally misjudged the United States. "We never comprehended," he wrote, "that an enemy could wage war as if geography did not exist. For the Germans, production was power. For the Americans, mobility was power. While Nazi factories trembled under Allied bombs, new American-built plants were appearing in territories the Luftwaffe couldn't reach. It was as if the U.S. had created a second industrial continent, invisible, untouchable, yet omnipresent in every theater of war. Germany's U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships by the hundreds. But even at their height, they couldn't stem the tide. American shipyards simply built more, faster than the Kriegsmarine could destroy them. It was a race of factories versus torpedoes, and factories won. The realization dawned too late, as the Reich cities began to burn under the bomb loads of aircraft built, maintained, and fueled by industries that had traveled halfway around the world to fight them. There was a moral dimension to this feat that went beyond logistics. America's power was not only in machines, it was in the belief that production itself could be a weapon of liberty. Factories, once symbols of peacetime ambition, became sanctuaries of purpose. In every city, posters reminded workers, "Your hands build freedom." The industrial war wasn't fought for conquest or empire. It was fought to prevent a world built on tyranny from erasing the possibility of progress. For the Axis, industry was a tool of control. Enforced labor, centralized planning, the exploitation of occupied lands. For the Allies, and particularly for America, it was a collective endeavor, a voluntary mobilization. No secret police forced those riveters to weld at midnight. They worked because they believed the world needed them to. That moral unity translated into efficiency. A rivet tightened for freedom was a rivet that never loosened. Production became personal, emotional. Roosevelt's fireside talks framed every increase in tonnage, or every ship launched as a moral victory. He wasn't wrong. It was the proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship. Even abroad, this ethic was felt. British engineers, Soviet mechanics, and Chinese laborers who assembled those shipped American factories saw not just steel, but solidarity. Every crate was a promise that America had not abandoned them to isolation or despair. That moral power was invisible to German analysts. It could not be measured in tons or units, but it powered the convoys more surely than oil. It kept the factories humming through blackouts, shortages, and grief, and in that sense, America's movable industry became more than a logistical triumph. It became a physical manifestation of belief. By 1943, generals began to understand what economists already knew. The war would not be decided by strategy alone. It would be decided by throughput. Every operation, Torch, Husky, Overlord, was an expression of logistical supremacy. The ability to land not just troops but entire supply chains gave the Allies the initiative everywhere. When Eisenhower's planners studied invasion blueprints, they thought in terms of factories per mile, not divisions per mile. Mobile shipyards followed fleets. Portable refineries followed armies. Workshops capable of producing tank parts were shipped to every major theater. Wherever an Allied base appeared, an American-made industrial ecosystem unfolded around it. It changed the psychology of warfare. The front line was no longer where soldiers fought, but where supplies stopped moving. To halt production was to halt victory. Germany never found an answer to that. Even after reorganizing under Speer's direction in 1942, German industry remained chained to railways, to bombed cities, to static infrastructure. America had broken those chains long before. By late 1943, Roosevelt and his generals had turned logistics into a weapon so overwhelming that every other strategy bent around it. From the Arctic Circle to the equator, the same prefabricated warehouses, the same Quonset huts, the same machinery appeared like a military signature of the United States. No empire had ever extended its reach through pure logistics alone. Until now, and soon all that power, all that mobile industry, would converge on the European continent itself, in an operation so vast that even the German High Command would struggle to comprehend how it was possible. The decisive moment was approaching, when the arsenal of democracy would cross not only oceans, but the very threshold of Europe. The year was 1943. The tide of the war had begun to shift, not on the battlefield, but in the warehouses, docks, and workshops of the free world. The arsenal of democracy was no longer a metaphor. It was alive, a sprawling, breathing organism of steel, steam, and sweat stretching from California to Cairo. In Britain, the air hummed with the rhythm of American machines. Across dozens of airfields, new hangars built from U.S. prefabricated steel now sheltered squadrons of flying fortresses and thunderbolts. The machines that had once stood in Detroit's Ford plant were now operating in Yorkshire and East Anglia, churning out replacement parts faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. Everywhere, the imprint of American industry appeared. The same crates, the same machinery, the same assembly manuals printed with familiar U.S. serial numbers. It was as if a piece of America itself had crossed the Atlantic. The North African campaign had already proven what this mobility could achieve. When Operation Torch launched in November 1942, American engineers landed alongside the infantry, not with rifles, but with bulldozers and generators. Within days of capturing Algiers, they were unloading components of portable machine shops, welding new docks, and laying down airstrips. The Germans had expected supply chaos. Instead, they found an enemy whose logistics seemed limitless. Fuel depots appeared in the desert where none had existed before. Tanks were repaired in the field by mobile factories that could be erected in hours. By 1943, that system had matured into something almost mechanical in its precision. Convoys ran on schedules tighter than train timetables. The average turnaround time for a Liberty ship from the U.S. East Coast to Britain and back dropped from 70 days to 43. Every port, every ship, every crate had its place in a vast industrial choreography. Behind it all stood the unsung generals of logistics: Admiral Emory Land of the U.S. Maritime Commission, General Brian Somervell of the Army Service Forces, and the countless officers of the Transportation Corps who coordinated a global ballet of steel. While armies fought in Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, these men waged their own war, against distance, against scarcity, against time, and they were winning. By mid-1943, the United States was producing more war materiel than the Axis powers combined. Every minute, a new rifle left an American factory. Every 5 minutes, a new truck. Every hour, a new tank. Every day, dozens of aircraft. But numbers alone didn't tell the whole story. What truly crushed the Reich was the continuity of that output, the ability to sustain it, expand it, and even relocate it when needed. German bombers could destroy a building, but not a system. And as that system spread across the globe, it began to show its ultimate purpose: to create the infrastructure for a second front in Europe. In 1943, as Allied leaders met in Casablanca and later Tehran, American planners were already mapping the logistical foundations for what would become Operation Overlord. They understood that the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would not be won by courage alone. It would require a supply chain strong enough to feed, fuel, and arm millions of men across a hostile ocean, so they began to prepare. Factories in the U.S. didn't just build weapons, they built pieces of Europe's future: portable harbors, floating docks, precast concrete roadways, even entire power stations. Everything that would be needed to sustain an invasion was built in segments, numbered, and stored, waiting for the day when it would all move east. This was industry as foresight. By the end of 1943, warehouses from Philadelphia to Glasgow were overflowing with the raw materials of liberation. Millions of tons of equipment packed and ready to move. It was the logistical equivalent of a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon. And in Berlin, for the first time, these began to stir. Intercepted intelligence hinted at massive American shipments of prefabricated steel, machinery, and cranes. German analysts couldn't understand why the Allies were exporting so much heavy industrial material, rather than just weapons. What they didn't know was that these were the components of a mobile Europe, a floating, portable infrastructure that would soon descend on their shores. The German Navy still believed the Atlantic Wall would hold. Their planners had calculated that even if the Allies landed, resupply would be impossible. They still thought like men of the last war, imagining that factories were fixed things. They didn't realize the truth. The factories were already on the way. The next stage would prove it, as the full machinery of American industry crossed into Europe itself, and the invasion of Normandy became not just a military operation, but a triumph of logistics unlike anything seen before in human history. Dawn. June 6, 1944, Normandy. The sea boiled with ships. From horizon to horizon, the surface of the English Channel was alive, a moving continent of steel, smoke, and will. But behind the waves of landing craft and the roar of naval guns, something greater was unfolding, the most ambitious industrial operation in human history. Operation Overlord was not just an invasion. It was the arrival of an entire industrial system, prefabricated, mobile, and self-sustaining, transported across the ocean to manufacture victory on foreign soil. For months before D-Day, American engineers and planners had been working on a secret project. Its codename Mulberry. The plan was breathtaking in scale, to build artificial harbors, massive floating ports that could be towed across the channel, anchored off the French coast, and serve as instant logistical hubs. Each Mulberry harbor consisted of miles of steel pontoons, floating roadways, and hollow concrete blocks called Phoenix caissons. Together they formed breakwaters and piers strong enough to unload thousands of tons of cargo per day. It was, in essence, the shipping of an entire port city across the ocean and reassembling it under enemy fire. These were the ultimate expression of America's new philosophy. That industry was no longer tied to geography. The United States had taken the idea of shipping factories abroad and expanded it to shipping infrastructure itself. When the first sections of Mulberry A and B began to arrive on the beaches of Normandy, the Germans were stunned. Aerial reconnaissance had reported strange movements of large structures in English ports, but no one in the Wehrmacht's high command had believed such a thing was possible. By June 9th, just 3 days after the first troops landed, Allied engineers had assembled functional harbor facilities capable of unloading 7,000 tons of supplies a day. Within a week, that number doubled. Tanks, trucks, food, fuel, all poured into France as if the invasion had a permanent city behind it. Hitler's generals were bewildered. The Atlantic Wall had been built on the assumption that the Allies could not land heavy equipment without capturing a major port. Yet here was a port, built in America, shipped in pieces and assembled under their noses. German intelligence officers began to piece together the scale of the deception. For years they had underestimated not only America's capacity for production, but its ability to make that production mobile. The Mulberries were only one part of the greater machine. Behind them came the floating pipelines of Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, carrying fuel directly from England to France. American tankers and engineers had transformed the seabed itself into an artery of petroleum, ensuring that Allied tanks would never run dry. Portable bridges, designed by British engineers and mass-produced in U.S. factories, spanned the French rivers within hours of capture. Mobile depots, built from the same prefabricated materials once used in North Africa, rolled off the beaches and spread inland. Everywhere the Allies advanced, American logistics followed, erecting machine shops, hospitals, bakeries, and fuel farms from crates that had crossed the Atlantic. It was the ultimate culmination of Roosevelt's industrial vision, a nation that could export not only weapons, but self-sustaining war infrastructure. For German soldiers and civilians alike, the realization came slowly, painfully. The bombers overhead were terrifying enough, but what truly crushed morale was the sense that the enemy's capacity was infinite. For every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared. For every bridge bombed, another spanned the gap within hours. It was as if the Allies had tapped into a boundless well of steel and determination. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, saw it clearly. In his post-war memoirs, he recalled that after Normandy, it was no longer a question of courage or ingenuity, and it was mathematics. Germany could not hope to compete with an adversary that could project industrial strength directly onto the battlefield. In the months following D-Day, the Allied advance through France became a triumph of supply. American truck convoys, the legendary Red Ball Express, thundered along newly laid routes delivering hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo. Many of those supplies had originated in factories thousands of miles away, shipped as components, reassembled in England, and moved once more into the heart of Europe. The Germans had underestimated the sea, the ship, and the system. They had believed oceans protected continents. America had proved that oceans could connect them. By late 1944, as Allied troops crossed into Belgium, Germany's last hope faded. Its industry lay shattered under the relentless bombing campaign. While America's mobile industry thrived and multiplied across the liberated lands, the factories that once filled the skies of Detroit with smoke now filled the skies of Europe with aircraft. The assembly lines that once rolled out automobiles now rolled out tanks, trucks, and the bridges they would drive across. Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes offensive, was born of desperation, a hope that logistics could be disrupted, that the Allies could be starved of momentum. But America's logistical network was no longer fragile. It was a living, regenerating force. Even in the dead of winter, supplies kept flowing, convoys kept rolling, and factories kept producing, across the ocean, across the continent, across history itself. When the smoke cleared over Europe, Germany stood surrounded not just by armies, but by a new kind of empire, an empire of production powered by liberty, and carried across the seas by ships that had brought with them the bones of entire factories. And soon, the full weight of that industrial juggernaut would bring the war to its final reckoning. Spring 45. The guns were falling silent, but the numbers still spoke, louder than any artillery. When historians later examined the war's ledgers, they found that victory had not been written on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets of industry. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, and 6,500 naval vessels. Each figure told a story of capacity beyond comprehension. For every ship Germany launched, America launched 15. For every tank the Reich fielded, America and her allies produced dozens more. Yet behind those raw statistics lay the true miracle, the mobility of it all. Factories in Illinois or California didn't just feed American forces. They powered the world. The same assembly lines that had built engines for U.S. bombers were replicated in Britain. Their tools and molds shipped months earlier in sealed containers. The same cranes used in New Jersey ports were reconstructed in Cherbourg and Antwerp, enabling the Allies to rebuild Europe's gateways almost overnight. Germany's economy, once the envy of Europe, had been shattered by the very principle it had ignored: flexibility. Its factories were rooted in geography, its logistics tethered to rail lines, its resources strangled by blockade. America's were not. In the ruins of Berlin, Albert Speer admitted what many had already known. The war, he said, was lost the moment the first American ship began to cross the Atlantic. He wasn't speaking only of troops or weapons. He meant the Liberty ships, those plain, unremarkable freighters whose cargoes carried the living blueprint of Allied victory. They brought not only supplies but systems, the machinery, the manuals, and the men to build and rebuild endlessly. German officers who had once sneered at American mass production now saw its terrible genius. Quantity had become quality. The precision lay not in a single machine, but in the process, a process that could replicate itself anywhere. Captured documents from the Reich's economic ministries reveal growing despair. Reports from 1944 show intelligence officers attempting to calculate U.S. industrial capacity. Their estimates fell short by more than half. "We are fighting a phantom industry," one report read. "No matter what we destroy, it seems to multiply." By the end of the war, that phantom had materialized into reality. In every liberated city, American-made machinery roared back to life. In Normandy, in Antwerp, in Naples, mobile depots became permanent factories, continuing to produce spare parts and construction materials for reconstruction. The same logistics that had invaded Europe now rebuilt it. The sheer scale of shipping remained unmatched in history. From 1941 to 1945, American shipyards launched over 75 million tons of merchant shipping, more than all the Axis nations combined. Each vessel represented the embodiment of Roosevelt's vision, that a democracy, once awakened, could turn industrial freedom into a weapon more powerful than any dictator's dream of conquest. When the war ended, many of those ships were still at sea, carrying the last waves of cargo, fuel, food, machinery, and humanitarian supplies. Factories once destined for war zones were redirected toward rebuilding them. In Germany's occupied cities, civilians watched as American engineers unloaded cranes, generators, and construction kits, the same kind of shipments that once sustained Allied armies. Now they were being used to rebuild power plants and bridges. The very process that had defeated the Reich was now repairing the world it had destroyed. The German people, stunned and broken, began to understand what their leaders had never grasped, that America's true weapon was not the bomb, nor the tank, but the boundless ability to produce and reproduce civilization itself. It was victory through creation, not destruction, but this triumph came at a cost, of lives, of labor, of exhaustion. And as the war's ruins gave way to the peace of 1946 and beyond, the machinery of wartime America faced a new challenge. What to do with an industrial system so vast it could have swallowed the world twice over? That reckoning, the transformation from wartime production to peacetime purpose, would define the next generation. When the last Liberty ship returned home, its decks empty and its hull rusting from years of service, the United States faced a paradox. Its war was over, but its machinery still thundered. In less than 4 years, America had created the largest industrial network in human history, a network that could now be turned toward peace. The same cranes that had once loaded bombers onto ships now hoisted steel for bridges and housing. The same engineers who had assembled refineries in Persia and Africa were dispatched to rebuild Europe's shattered infrastructure. This was the beginning of a new kind of influence, not imperial, but logistical. The blueprint for America's post-war role was drawn not in politics but in shipping manifests. The techniques that had moved factories across oceans during the war became the foundation of global reconstruction. In 1948, when the Marshall Plan began to pump life into Western Europe, it followed the same logistical pathways as the Lend-Lease convoys. Cargo ships once filled with tanks and turbines now carried tractors, power tools, and prefabricated housing. Engineers who had built wartime depots now erected power stations, shipyards, and industrial parks from Norway to Italy. America's mobile industry, designed to fight tyranny, now rebuilt democracy. Across the Atlantic, German workers found themselves unpacking crates stamped U.S. Army Engineer Corps, filled with machine tools identical to those that had powered Allied production. It was a strange irony. The same system that had defeated them was now reviving them. This industrial benevolence was as strategic as it was moral. A stable Europe would become the front line of a new kind of conflict, the Cold War. To sustain it, the United States built a global logistical architecture. Bases in Britain, France, Germany, and the Pacific were supplied through the same standardized systems born in World War II. The Quonset hut, that humble, curved shelter, spread across the world, serving as barracks, hospitals, classrooms, and offices. The modular design, once used to build mobile factories, became a permanent feature of American influence abroad. NATO's logistics, established in 1949, were direct descendants of wartime coordination. The same principles that had moved factories to Europe now allowed entire armies to operate under a unified supply doctrine. Fuel lines, transport fleets, standardized equipment, all bore the DNA of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy. The German army had once prided itself on its engineering. Now it studied the American model of logistics, adopting modular repair systems and standardized components. Industrial mobility had rewritten the manual of modern warfare. Beyond the military sphere, the same ideas gave birth to something even larger: globalization. The standard shipping container, introduced in the 1950s, was a direct conceptual heir to the wartime practice of modular shipping. The notion that goods, or factories, could move anywhere efficiently became the foundation of the modern world economy. The war that had taught America to dismantle and transport entire production lines had inadvertently created a world where everything could move. By the 1960s, American-built refineries, power plants, and factories dotted the globe. In Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, the United States had become more than a nation. It was an industrial presence everywhere. Germany, Japan, and Italy, once ruined, rose again through that same process, rebuilt with machinery that had crossed the oceans under wartime convoys. Even the Soviet Union, though now an adversary, had inherited thousands of U.S. machine tools from the Lend-Lease era, which continued to power its industries for decades. It was a quiet revolution, not of ideology, but of logistics. The war's greatest secret weapon turned out to be not a bomb or a code, but a method. The ability to move production, to rebuild faster than destruction could occur, became the defining strength of the modern world. And behind it all lay the memory of those wartime ships, heavy with the bones of factories, sailing through dark waters toward a future no one had yet imagined. The war was over, but its echo remained in every container port, every global supply chain, every alliance built on shared logistics. What began as America's response to tyranny had become humanity's blueprint for rebuilding itself. From destruction came design, from war came motion, and in the quiet that followed, the world realized that America had not just shipped factories across the ocean, it had shipped the future. The Atlantic is quiet now. Where convoys once moved through fog and fear, only waves remain, rolling endlessly between continents that no longer feel so far apart. The war ended long ago, yet the steel ghosts of that era still sleep beneath the sea. Liberty ships resting on the ocean floor, their cargo holds sealed with time. Inside some, still encased in salt and silt, lie the remnants of an idea that the power to build could cross any distance. That was the true secret of America's wartime miracle. Not its weapons, not its armies, but its belief that creation could travel faster than destruction. In an age when Europe was burning and cities were reduced to rubble, the United States sent not just bombs but blueprints, not just soldiers but systems. It exported the one resource the modern world could not live without: the means to rebuild. Factories once forged for war became the scaffolding of peace. The same technologies that filled the skies with bombers now filled them with passenger planes. The same logistics that fed armies now fed nations. The Germans, who had once thought geography could define power, learned that the new frontier was motion, the capacity to move ideas, machines, and people beyond all borders. And from that lesson, the modern world emerged. Today, every cargo ship, every port, every global factory still echoes that wartime discovery. That industry itself can migrate, adapt, and endure. In the end, the arsenal of democracy was more than a slogan. It was proof that the greatest weapon of the 20th century wasn't the atomic bomb. It was the factory that could cross an ocean. In that quiet triumph, beneath the hum of engines and the whisper of steel on water, lay the essence of the modern age, that the power to build is the power to endure.